All right. Audacity in 3, 2, 1.
Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co host, Marissa Roy. And in today's episode, we're going to be chatting all about how to prevent burnout.
Yeah.
Or crashing and burning.
How to not crash and burn in your health administrative. So, yeah, I mean, this episode was actually inspired by a group call that we were both on the other day, where it was kind of like a coaching clinic where a bunch of people were going through their client issues and things that they were struggling with, a bunch of different fitness coaches. And I just noticed and pointed out the trend that there was a lot of the same thing happening of this client did really, really well for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And then, oh my God, they just ghosted or they completely fell off the wagon or whatever. And it really got me thinking, like, why is this happening to everyone? And I think something that we do unintentionally as fitness coaches in the industry is we are unintentionally perpetuating this all or nothing mindset, this go out hot out the gate and make it super unsustainable, see some quick results and then burn out. We perpetuate that cycle, not because we have ill intentions, but because we're so excited about this client, like doing well and taking on more and doing all this stuff. But it's like inherently not actually keeping the long-term or the big picture in mind because we're so excited. They're so excited. We're just feeding off each other's energy. So I was like, why don't we just make a podcast about how to prevent this issue in the first place? Because I feel like it could not only help coaches, but it could really help the people actually going through the initial stages of their transformation, and hopefully prevent that cycle from happening. Because a lot of our clients that we work with are people that notoriously go out hot out the gate, can't sustain it after 30 days, fall off, start over, repeat. So we just really want to put an end to that.
Yeah. And I think that it's something that we have experienced before, and we have definitely, we know what it feels like. And, especially Marissa just recently signed up with a new coach, and like, it is exciting. You make a big investment and, you're like, oh, I'm ready to kill it. Right. And you have a lot of momentum, and you're a lot of times kind of relying a little bit on motivation to get you started, and you're super, super, super motivated, but eventually that kind of fizzles out. And so this podcast is going to be a little bit of like, okay, well, what do I do now that momentum is gone, and how do I continue within my fitness journey, and not just kind of crash and burn and be one of those people who just kind of, well, I guess I fell off. I need another coach, or that didn't work for me.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's just like, first and foremost, it's not your fault that like you are doing this, right? It's all with the best intentions every single time. Usually both parties with the best intentions, right? Here's your plan. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Let me get started. And then like the first time that life happens, right? It's like, well, we go on a trip or something came up, and then we ultimately, quote unquote, fail on a protocol, or we don't complete something. And unfortunately, that creates a gap so large between what you were doing and what you're not doing now, that we see ourselves as a total failure. And then we have to kind of start over. We are under the perception that we have to start over and over again, when really we just need to like pick back up with a baseline habit that we can get towards. So I guess like just some context of like, what's the alternative? You're probably wondering, okay, well, yeah, like I just want to get started. I want to jump into it. I want to do what I need to do. And a lot of people, when they start or restart a fitness journey, they just jump right into whatever protocols, whether it's counting points or calories or macros or tracking all your food or whatever, just jumping right in, right? And sometimes I think that there's good energy to that. I think it's important to harness that energy and to use it and funnel it. But at the same time, it can be a dangerous energy because it's so much that we will add more on our plate than is sustainable. So something that, I would like to kind of contrast is just like, what are the pros and cons of like a fast start versus like almost holding yourself back and feeling like I could do more. I should be doing more. Because that's what a lot of our clients always feel like at the beginning, like we're working on just a couple habits and they're like, I feel like I should have totally overhauled my pantry by now. And we haven't. And maybe they're still eating a lot of the same things that they don't feel great about. But I think it's like, that's, if you feel like you're holding yourself back, it's kind of a good place to be. But it can also dilute motivation a little bit. If you get started with all this hot energy and you're like, well, I'm only using 10% of it, like it can almost be discouraging because you don't see the fast progress and you don't see any quick results. And, that can be demotivating, or, it can, I guess, fan out the flame a lot earlier. And then, it could lead to more struggles. But what I found is that it actually leads to more productive conversations earlier, right? If we hold ourselves back, we kind of fan out the flame. It's like, wow, I feel like I should be doing more. I feel like I'm not doing enough. I feel like I am already a failure because I haven't seen 10 pounds lost in the first 2 weeks. Like, actually, let's explore that inner dialogue, right? Why do you feel that way? Why have all the things you've done in the past perpetuated that? And look at all the things you have done in a matter of, let's say, 2 weeks, right?
Yeah. So I think it's really important there that there is communication between both coach and client. And I think it's really important that a client feels like they have that space to communicate. And so it lasted 6 minutes is how long. Oh, okay. Thank you, honey. Is how long it lasted for Colton Till. He was just bringing me trash and he was going to go back to watching a show. But I think it's important that there is that, again, that open communication, that client feels like they have that safe space to openly communicate how they're actually feeling. Because if they're feeling, I think it's easier to, in my opinion, I think it's easier for clients to communicate that they feel like they should be doing more versus a client to be able to communicate like, hey, this is actually too hard.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm having a really hard time keeping up with everything. So it is, in their mind, easier to just ghost and not have that hard conversation. But I think recognizing, again, like we were talking about, like your coach has the best intentions for you and they're not mind readers. So, having that I guess kind of expectation from the start, like, hey, just check in, just let me know. Is it too hard? Is it not enough? Like, kind of let me know and we'll tailor your program accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But unfortunately, most environments, working environments, coach client environments, athletic environments, family environments, I would say a majority in general do not foster open communication where that is safe or that is normal. So people's defense mechanisms will protect them from, opening up like that, especially about something as sensitive as health and fitness. So it's really our responsibility as coaches to like prevent that from happening in the first place. And I think the best way to do that is to almost set the bar too low. And something I said to a couple of the coaches that were like struggling with goal setting for the clients, I was like, you should look for a relief reaction when you set a goal. Like, oh my God, that sounds so easy and doable. I never thought that a first protocol could be like that. That's the reaction you want to go for. You should, as a client, as a person on your fitness journey, the first goal that you set should be something that is literally a relief to set, because it's relieving pressure off yourself. Because let's say you make an investment in yourself. Let's say you join on with a coach and you spend, hundreds or thousands of dollars on yourself. And you're like, oh my God, there's all this pressure on myself. I have to do perfect. I have to jump in. I have to do it all immediately. When in reality, your first protocol should make you feel relieved that like, oh, I can do this in all the busyness of my life. Right. And then from there, through the week, you're going to do it really, really well. And then you're going to be like, wait, I totally could be doing more. I'm not doing enough. And then you can approach with like, what else? And then we can talk about that. Right. And so I think the mindsets that have to be unworked at the beginning of the journey is that you have to feel like you're totally maxed out on your plate, on your to-dos. Otherwise, you're not doing enough. That's totally false. And in fact, if you have more in the tank, it's like good, because this is a long journey. You're going to need a lot left in the tank. And so you can really ask yourself those questions at the beginning. When you set a habit, do I feel like this is actually kind of too easy? And I think if the answer is yes, you're probably on the right track. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. Um, and I think that a lot of it too is like you were saying before, it's like that financial aspect, and it's got to be that it can't be low enough where it's like, meh, we've got a third co-host today.
That's fine.
It's not low enough where it doesn't matter, the whole Planet Fitness, like, oh, it's just $10, so whatever. I'm just like not even going to go to the gym. And it does need to be a substantial amount that really makes you feel like you have skin in the game. Really, again, it's like, man, I'm really going to take this seriously. But I do understand, because it's like, well, if I'm paying all this money, why am I just doing this? Like, why am I just working on like stress medication, or why am I just going on walks? And it's like, well, because like you're saying, Marissa, it's like everything that you've done in the past has been 75 hard. It's been super extreme. It's been these juice detoxes, it's been this and that. And so sometimes it does kind of feel like, okay, well, I like, this is it. This is the last thing that I'm going to do. And so therefore it needs to be this big shebang. And it's like kind of what you were saying before. It's like, well, that's probably why you failed in the past. That's why you haven't been able to sustain it. And so kind of recognizing like, okay, well, maybe I should be open to trying something new and not feeling like it has to be what I've done in the past.
Well, that's what you're paying for, right? You're
Right.
literally paying for something, to be held accountable to something that's actually harder for you to do. Because if I had to survey all of the people that we work with, I would definitely be able to find that doing things that are more extreme and appealing and faster is going to be the preferred method of application to someone's fitness journey for like most people. And most people find that easier to get into because there's clear rules, there's a clear deadline, there's all this black and white. And so it's easier to do, which is why these things are so popular. And so what you're literally paying for is to be forced to go against the grain and to stick with that, because that is arguably so much harder mentally to handle than the quick thing, even though the repercussions are way worse when you go through that cycle over and over again. It's still comfortable and it's still easier. So what you're paying for is accountability to discomfort and accountability to actually doing something that will reverse the tides of what you've been doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. So did you want to keep going over pros and cons?
No, we kind of passed that part, but I mean, I kind of also went over like the questions you should ask yourself, like when you are at the beginning. And number one is like, do I feel like I could be doing way more? Right. And that can give you the tell all of, is this sustainable? And like, cause you really, and then also assessing the context of your life, of when you're doing this habit, what's going on, And a lot of times people start a fitness journey and they're like, oh man, my first week was horrible because I had family come in town, or we had to travel, or this and that. And it's like, but you also did the easy habit every single day. And it's like, okay, the context of your life was shit was happening and you still got the thing done. To me, that is a success, rather than, oh, I didn't do enough. I didn't overhaul my groceries. I didn't completely change everything. It's like, but you still stuck through it when life happened, right? When you had to go back and forth to the hospital because someone was sick, or you had family in town and you had to cater to them and cater to yourself. It's like, if your goal can fit in that, then imagine what it's going to be like when you have weeks where things are easy and nothing's happening. Like, so much easier. So really just asking yourself, what is the context of your day to day? And if you're able to fit it into the life happens, or maybe you start at the quote unquote perfect time and there's nothing happening in your life, then you have to ask yourself the question, like, am I still going to be able to do this when insert life circumstance? And if you can insert that life circumstance and you can confidently say, and I'll say confidently means an 8 out of 10 or higher, anything below an 8 out of 10, complete confidence, I would say, okay, time to reevaluate, right? That you are in a good spot if you're 8 out of 10. And the thing about it is that habits stack over time and habits build. So just because, you can only see yourself doing really simple things right now doesn't mean that you're stuck there and you're limited in your capacity. That's something you build, but you don't build it by jumping in. You build it by building it, right, over time.
Yeah. And I think that one of the other big mindset things to continue to work on is also having that growth versus fixed mindset. And that's really, really, really important because, you know, you are going to be faced with life. Like adversity is going to happen. And if you have the mentality of like, oh, I have to be perfect, like everything has to be just right, and then something happens and you fail, or, you know, quote unquote fail, and that's how you perceive what just happened in your mind, it's going to be really, really difficult to get back on the horse. And I think that kind of recognizing, like, okay, this is a learning experience. Like maybe it didn't go as well as I would have liked, but what can I do better next time? Like, how can I improve? And so I have a client who travels. So, like, she's a little jet setter. Like, she's all over the place. And she has been able to lose 40 pounds, you know, drinking wine, having vacation, doing all these things. And when we were talking about an upcoming trip that she had with her family, she's like, I don't want to restrict myself. I don't want to be really counting macros on days that I don't want to. And she's like, if I have that capacity, then I will. And I was like, cool. And I was like, what are you going to do for like workouts? And she's like, I'm going to try to go to the gym once. I'm like, awesome. And she's like, because even if I go once, and she's like, that's unheard of for me. Like, I don't usually go to the gym on vacation. And so she was like, yeah. And she's like, I didn't move as much as I expected. And she was like, well, that was just kind of like what they did. And I was like, hey, like you went to the gym, like you went out of your way. Like someone said that they were going to go with you and then they didn't. And then you went out of your way to go do that. And I was like, that's amazing. Like, is it the quote unquote, like perfect plan? I mean, that's hard to argue, right? Like maybe it would have been better for her to go maybe 2 or 3 times, but like that was the perfect plan for her for that vacation. And like that was a step in the right direction. And so a lot of times we have this, like we were talking about, like this idea that like everything has to be super big or it's not really going to add up. But like those habits, like you were saying, will stack over time. And you may not go to the gym every single time that you're on vacation, but like you're like, well, maybe I walk more. Like maybe I like just subconsciously like drink more water, or like prioritize like protein. Like all of those things will just kind of start to occur naturally the more that you work on them.
Well, and the more positive psychology you build around it, right? Because
Right.
the problem with setting the bar too high is that it literally just perpetuates, oh, I'm still a failure. I didn't do it. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. Didn't do that. Instead, why don't we just set the bar somewhere where we know we can hit it, build wins, and then those habits that we can hit get a little bit more every time because we're actually building momentum versus just being like, I didn't do this week. I didn't do this week. It's the classic example of if I told the same person in two different situations, two different realities, let's work out twice per week, and they hit two and they're like, oh my God, I'm crushing it. Versus if I said, let's work out 5 times per week, and they worked out twice and they were like, oh my God, I'm a failure, because the gap between where they think they need to be and where they are is so large. But if we can close that gap, then they're going to feel successful, and emotions drive our actions. So if we feel successful, then we will be more motivated to take the next action rather than self-sabotage, right? And going down the spiral. So this actually segues really nicely into when you are goal setting and where you're setting the bar is we want to use what's essentially called the zone of proximal development. And you can just imagine this as 3 circles, each within each other. The smallest circle on the inside is the zone that people can do things independently. So like, for example, this person might be able to make it to the gym once per week on their own and not need any help to do that. So if we're asking them to go to the gym once per week, as a coach, we are not doing them any favors because they can already do that independently. So that's a waste of their money. But if we ask them to go to the gym 5 times, that is a very large step. And so the widest, most outer circle, skipping out 2 layers, is beyond the zone of proximal development, what the person cannot do and is unrealistic for them to do at this current moment. And so if we ask them to do that, this is a big mistake that a lot of coaches make in the industry, is because we live and die by our fitness routines. We think that what's easy for us is easy for others, and it's not. So we set the bar somewhere that we think is reasonable for us that is still unreasonable for them. And so that's just a symptom of not getting to know your client and really understanding their baseline. And so we set the bar too high. That's outside of the zone of proximal development, and it's going to perpetuate those failure beliefs and thoughts. Now, the middle circle outside the center, but inside the most outmost, is the zone of proximal development, which is essentially what someone can do with support, with guidance, but not independently and isn't too much. And so this might be 2 times a week for that person that can go once independently, but not 5 times. And so if we can push them to do that second one, eventually that second one will become second nature. And then their independent zone will be 2 workouts per week. And then we push them slightly outside of that. And we continue that pattern. And that's just how people grow and build habits. And eventually what's within their independent circle is enough for them to actually do this on their own forever. And that's how you get someone to be self-sufficient and independent in their journey. But unfortunately, if we're constantly missing the mark on where we actually are in somebody's capabilities, then we're not going to be able to actually make the progress, because then we go out hot. We are way outside our zone of proximal development, but we're maybe white knuckling it for a little while. Something happens, we're a failure. And then we go back to just whatever we can do independently, which is not that much. And then we go back to square zero or ground zero, square one, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really important. And so I think that it's also like your circles are going to grow as you grow. And so it's not, yeah. So it's not that you're just stuck at, the 2 workouts, or you're just working on walk, like all of that stuff will compound, and the capabilities that you have will expand. So kind of recognizing like, okay, if I start off slow, that doesn't mean that I'm always going to be having to take these small, slow steps. It's everything is going to compound, and you're going to grow, and eventually get to the point like, oh my gosh, remember when I was just doing this in the beginning? And it's like, but like you're saying, you had to build those positive experiences. You had to compound like your things become habits. And eventually you get to this place where you're like, oh, wow, I can do this. I can do this independently. Like this is things that I can control. And this, this is my life now. This is my lifestyle. So, recognizing, I think the other aspect of things is, when you sign on with a coach or to do a program, a lot of times there's a time limit, and it's, because you can't just have this indefinite, like you're just a client of ours forever, right? There has to be some sort of 12 weeks, 6 weeks, 12 month or whatever that may be. And sometimes what happens is clients feel like it's this like deadline, like I have to be at this goal by this date, or therefore I'm a failure and it was a waste of money. And kind of recognizing like, yes, you are working with your coach and you have them for a prolonged period of time, but your fitness journey it's not a race. It's not this deadline. You're still going to work on things afterwards. So one of the things I ask clients is like, hey, would you be okay if you were like at 75% of the goal by the time you ended with us? Like you're 75% closer to where you were before us? Because if you feel like every day you wake up, I'm not at my goal, I'm a failure. I'm not at my goal, I'm not a failure. I'm not going to be there. That's going to be really, really difficult mindset to kind of get out of. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, could you imagine like you sign up with someone for 12 months and that's a thought in your head the entire day? Like, so just kind of recognizing that, yes, you have your coach with you for that period of time, but that doesn't mean that like fitness just stops when you're done. And that like, it's okay if you do take a little bit of a slower time to get to where your goal is, but kind of recognizing like everything is in place for things to be sustainable and for you to be able to continue on your own afterwards. Hopefully, if you have a good coach.
Yeah. And I think like with continuing on your own in the long run, something that was kind of like nagging at me the whole time that I wanted to say was it was a little bit of a step backwards, but I agree with everything that you said. And I think it's important that we have a whole episode on like burning down the idea of your timeline and just like going day by day and having an abundance mindset towards like, this is how far I've come, not how far I have to go. So I think that was beautifully said. But something about like just being in that zone of proximal development and also getting yourself to a place where you can be independent long-term, because that's ultimately the goal. And if that's not the goal of your coach, I would reevaluate your coach, because our job is not to keep you here forever. It's to empower you to be independent. And so if you think back to the 3 circles, the zone of proximal development, The quote that kind of comes to mind is like, it's like a fight or flight sort of quote, but it's like humans default to their level of reflex, not to their level of like training or their peak performance. So for example, if you're going to fight a bear, you will default to the level of practice and reflexive responses that you have trained yourself to have to fight that bear, right? Versus that you're not just going to turn on this new level of potential within yourself of like, oh my God, I have all these skills that I've never practiced before. I'm going to pull out all these kung fu moves and defeat the bear, right? That doesn't happen. Maybe it happens in movies, and maybe it happens in freak circumstances, like, you know, the person who can, with the adrenaline rush, push the car off of their baby to save their baby because it's instinctual or something. But most cases, and especially things that aren't life or death scenarios, like just habits and lifestyle, you're going to default to your level of reflex in training, not to your highest potential in training. And so that is kind of what the independent zone is, in that middle smallest circle. Is that's kind of your fallback, your reflexes. What have you made true habits? And so when you build and build and build your capacity, you have to ask yourself, like, when shit hits the fan, what is my baseline? And is that baseline good enough to sustain me with where I am? Is that baseline good enough to keep me maintaining versus regaining, right? If we're talking weight loss. And so that's like a competence in a certain set of skills that you didn't have before. And so I think a lot of times the crappy weeks or the life happens are great indicators of where did my baseline fall that time. And if you're seeing improvements on that from crappy week to crappy week, no matter how far they're interspersed, I think that's a really good indicator to say, well, you know, when you start having bad weeks and those are just your, you know, maintenance versus progress weeks, that's a great indicator that you're fine to go on your own, because even if shit hit the fan, your default network, your default mode is going to essentially be what is going to keep you where you are. Now, that's not to say that habits cannot be undone and that we cannot build bad habits on top of good ones or undo good habits. But that's under the understanding that you keep working on yourself, you keep working on improving. But, you know, if your shit weeks are kind of a baseline for you now, I think that's a great kind of mile marker that you can rely on. And it just takes a while to get to that point.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of our clients kind of have the same thing. It's like, or the same thoughts. It's like, this took me a little bit longer than I expected to reach my goal, but it was what I needed. Right. Like everything that I was taught, all the habits, all the skills.
Yeah.
And if you went too fast, it's like it wouldn't have stuck, or I wouldn't have built that, like, oh no, this is actually who I am as a person now. Cause it's like, it was just a short amount of time. So I think that just kind of recognizing like, okay, it is okay to go a little bit slower and to try not to compare yourself to someone else, because you never know what they're going through in their journey and what it actually looks like. And if it is slower, like there's a rhyme and reason for that. And communicating with your coach and letting them know, like, it's okay to have these thoughts. I think that's really important to recognize, that it's not just, you know, you snap your finger and you don't have any like negative invasive thoughts. It's like, it's okay to have these and like communicate them with your coach and have them be able to walk you through, hey, like, let's question that. Let's challenge that. Like how, like what is actually happening. So you have those really good conversations that will move you forward.
Yeah, right. Because you are not your thoughts. You can have thoughts, but not over identify with them and say that that is true. Right.
Yeah.
I guess last thing, if it's okay, can I be a little nerdy?
Yeah, go for it. Always.
I was just having this conversation, like literally just before this, with a couple of friends about kind of building and breaking habits. And it kind of goes back into that like default mode that I was talking about. But, you know, when you mentioned like not comparing yourself to others' journeys, it really made me think of this, which is like, so my background's in neuroscience, right? And I oftentimes forget to mention that, but that's something that I'm really thankful that I have, because I know how our brains actually grow and develop and learn, and we develop and break habits. And so when you think about neurons, the cells that actually communicate messages to each other that get us to think things, do things, whatever, that literally controls our brain, you basically can think of these neurons as like each set or sequence of neurons is a habit, is a pattern, is a thought or a behavior that you have that is signaled a certain number of times. And I think it really comes down to reps. Your habits come down to reps. How many times have you repeated this habit, and how many times have you, reinforced it? And so when you increase the amount of reps that you do for a certain habit, let's say exercise, and you get a reward from that, you feel good, you repeat that behavior, every single time you kind of override your urge to not exercise and you do it anyways, the sequence of neurons that communicate with each other that you are recruiting in order to do that get stronger together each time. And there's literal cell hypertrophy that happens. So like if you think of the neurons as like little strings that attach to each other, they get thicker. Like they go from being like a 1-point thickness to like a 2-point to a 10-point thickness. And like the actual, like lack of a better word, girth of the neuron like expands, it gets thicker. And it's literally like muscle hypertrophy. More reps equals more hypertrophy. And the same goes for undoing habits and patterns, is that the less you use something, the more it's going to just atrophy, the more it's going to kind of wither away a little bit. The thickness of that pathway decreases. And so we are constantly, whether we realize it or not, reinforcing or not reinforcing certain patterns and pathways. So when we're learning to build or break habits, it's a matter of using the ones that we need to use as much as possible and trying to limit the use of other ones that we're trying to break. Now, the unfortunate part is that every journey is individual, because if you think about, you have a brain that has been with you your entire life, right? It is something that has constantly been evolving and changing from birth to reinforce patterns and habits that you have developed through childhood, teachings, etc. And so if you have a lifetime's worth of self-sabotage to undo, I'm sorry to say it, but those pathways, those cells, those neurons, they are going to be very thick and hypertrophied, and they're going to be very, very well used. And you're going to have weaker ones that you're trying to train to take over. So just for perspective, like if you are trying to break lifelong habits, you have to give yourself some grace in the fact that you might be fighting an uphill battle for a little bit longer than somebody who doesn't have that same history and context. And that is okay, but you just need to know what you're in for, right? It's not going to be an easy journey, but it's so worthwhile. But just know that just because somebody else had something happen, what seemed like overnight, maybe their history was just, they didn't have as much of the history built up to that point. And that's okay. But you cannot compare yourself, because it's literally biology and the biology that you've built. And you can't fault yourself for that. We are where we are, and we need to move forward from that. So just know that maybe it is harder for you. Maybe it is a little tougher to undo these patterns, these thoughts, these behaviors, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it because somebody else had it easier. It actually makes it more worthwhile. And so you can think of the use it or lose it concept when it comes to your neurons and how your brain creates patterns and behaviors and relies on habits. The stronger that those habits are, the thicker that those neurons become, the stronger they are in your brain. But that doesn't mean that you can't retrain new ones, and your neurons are constantly growing, shrinking based on every little choice you make every day. So every choice counts, and you're able to undo that. And honestly, the more reps you can get in faster with habits and building those and building up the wins and not focusing on the losses, the more you're going to reverse that cycle faster, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love when you nerd out. It's super fun. And I think this is a lot of reason why, we have these conversations sometimes with clients. It's like, if I could just like wave a magic wand and tomorrow you woke up and everything was perfect, right? Like you just, I'm at my goals, like boom. Like in a perfect world, you're like, yeah, that sounds amazing. Like, why would I not want to just do that? And it's the same kind of concept when it comes to weight loss surgery or taking a pill. It's like, you're not building any sort of skills to be able to like actually even just like keep your results. So even if you do get them, you're not going to be able to maintain them because you didn't become the person you needed to be. You didn't learn all those habits. And so yes, it sometimes would feel easier. Like, let me just be at my goals already, or let me just like take this like magic thing. But there's a reason. And all of this is a journey. So hopefully you feel a little bit like if this is you, if you feel like, okay, I'm like, I'm getting close to maybe, January and I'm like, I'm going to start on my health and fitness journey or whatever it may be. Hopefully you feel like, okay, it's okay if it takes a little bit longer. Like I'm becoming a different person through this process. And like, I'm going to be really, really thankful when I get to the other side.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. You can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christy Lynn Fit and Marissa is at Marissa Roy Fitness. Thank you guys so much for listening. And we hope to see you back next week.